So as I mentioned, we're in the book of Leviticus, and we've already talked about the sacrifices that are detailed at the beginning. I mentioned this last week, or last time we talked about the book of Leviticus, that it's kind of considered the speed bump in the Bible. And the reason for that is people often start reading the Bible, they have great intentions, they go through Genesis and Exodus and the narrative, it just pulls you along, it's riveting, and then you get to Leviticus and it's got all these strange details and ceremonies, and it's kind of the point at which a lot of people just give up. One of our aims is to kind of keep everyone going, and we're trying to read the Bible together. We're going to go to the book of Numbers next. What we hope to do here kind of on Sunday morning is just give you enough of an overview or context so that, you'll just be excited to keep on reading. And chapter 23 of the book of Leviticus, where maybe at first the details seem much and maybe a little strange, I'm convinced it is one of the most fascinating passages in the Bible, and there's a lot there. I'd ask that you turn with me. If you didn't bring your own Bibles, you can find the passage on page 88 of the Bibles in the chairs around you. And I just encourage everyone to have a Bible open as we read together. Time doesn't permit, I wish it did, but time doesn't permit for us to read the whole thing. But we're just going to start in verse 1 and then kind of work our way through this chapter, maybe gaining some overall knowledge and explanation of what we're looking at. In many ways, today is a great day to look at this passage. We kind of stand at the end of an old year, getting ready for a new year. We're aware of the calendar. And the reason I say it's a good time for us to look at this passage, God actually lays out a calendar for his people in the Old Testament to follow, and it contains a series of feasts and festivals which kind of mark out the year, if you will. And, let's just dive in and take a look at them. I'll begin reading in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, 'These are my appointed feasts, the appointed feasts of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies.'" And then the very first thing that's detailed in verse 3 is the Sabbath, and it's almost like a paradigm for the 7 feasts and festivals that are to follow. So verse 3 says this, "There are 6 days when you may work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work wherever you live. It is the Sabbath to the Lord." And so there are 6 days when you do all your work and labor and go about your business. But on the 7th day, weekly, there is this time of rest, of celebration that's dedicated to assembling together and praising the Lord. And this day almost becomes a paradigm for the 7 feasts and festivals that follow. And I'm just, by way of summary, going to kind of work our way through the feasts and festivals that are there. Let me say this. A couple of details so we get oriented, and then we're going to kind of get into the meaning. But for details, you should know this, that the Old Testament calendar that God had for his people in the Old Testament was not a solar calendar that followed the sun. Ours is a solar calendar, right? We start in January, and there are 365 days as our earth goes around the sun, and we get through December, and our earth is gone one time around the sun. It's based on the sun. Theirs was a lunar calendar, which was based on the moon. The moon goes through its cycle from new moon to new moon in 28 days, and so each of their month followed the moon's cycles. And so their calendar doesn't meet up with ours. It starts in the first month, corresponding to roughly our March and April, and in the very first month of the year. So maybe you can kind of think of it like a big circle. I don't know how else to picture this, but you start in the first month of the year, which happens to be in spring. And it's going to cycle around and go all the way through the year, 12 months, 12 moon cycles. And the days are going to change slightly. Like, sometimes we celebrate Easter on different days. The reason for that is we have a lunar calendar versus a solar calendar. But somewhere in March and April is the top of the year. And there are 3 festivals that all kind of coincide and go together. The very first 3, they're in that first month. And so the very first celebration, it's in the first month that you have, and by the way, this is in the springtime, is the Feast of Passover. And you see that the explanation of Passover starts in verse 4. And basically, we've talked already here in this church about what the Feast of Passover was all about. You remember how God's people were slaves in Egypt, and God brought them out from there with all these miracles. The very last one, the 10th plague, was the Passover plague. Remember that? Where God's people, they sacrificed a lamb, and then they took the blood and covered their doorposts with that blood, and everyone who had blood on their doorpost and was covered by the blood was safe, and all those who were not covered by the blood were not safe. And it was that kind of miracle that God used to bring his people up out of Egypt. And so every year there was this feast that they celebrated where they gathered together to eat lamb and to drink, and they had bread, unleavened bread, and they just celebrated that God brought them up out of Egypt. And God said, okay, there's going to be a celebration you have every year in the first month, celebrate the Passover. The very next day, there was another feast that started. It lasted for a week. It was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is the second. It starts in verse 6. The details of it start in verse 6. It's the second of the 7 festivals that you find throughout the calendar year. So you have Passover. The very next day starts the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it goes for one week. Does that make sense? The following day, there was another feast. It was called the Feast of First Fruits. And you can see the details of that starting in verse 9. So you had Passover. The next day starts the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The next day was the Feast of First Fruits. And here was the idea. Okay, it was springtime. And all the people, they worked out in the field. That's how they grew their food. What would happen is, early on, you would hide seed in the ground. And at some point in the very early spring, the very first sprouts would come up. And when you saw those first sprouts, it was like there was this promise that an entire harvest was one time going to come. And so right away in the spring, in this first month, what God had his people do is he had them take some of those very first fruits, like the first grains that popped up. And when they came to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, on the day of first fruits, they would take those first fruits, those first bit of grain, and they'd wave them before the Lord along with some other sacrifices. They did it well. But I just want you to see that in the Passover, there was a Passover. The next day was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then there was the Feast of First Fruits, where you take the very first bit of your harvest, that first promise, which pointed forward to the full harvest, and you'd wave them before God. Okay, so that happened in the very first month. And from that day on first fruits, you would start counting. 1, 2, 3. Each day would be another number, 4, 5, until you got to the number 50. So you'd start on first fruits, you just start counting each day, and when you'd finish counting 50, you got to the next major festival, which was called the Feast of Weeks, because there was going to be 7 weeks, 50 days, between first fruits and this next celebration. So from one Sunday to 50 days later, another Sunday, you'd have this, it was called the Feast of Weeks. And it was also, because of the number 50, also called Pentecost, which may be a name you're more familiar with. Pentecost means 50. And here's the idea. You wave those first bit of fruits to God, and it was like a down payment. And what would happen is at the very first harvest of grain, when you brought in the first bit of crop, then that would be 50 days later about, and that's when you would come with bundles of that first crop, and there was actually 2 loaves of bread which you would bake, which would symbolize your celebration of the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, and you would wave those before God along with other sacrifices that were done. And if you look, that whole explanation begins in verse 15, and there was a concern for the poor there. So if you look at verse 22, we read this: "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God." And so, as a part of this celebration, you realize that this entire harvest had come from God, who was being gracious to you, and so you wanted to extend that grace to others as well by leaving some of the field in your crop for the poor to glean. That was the Feast of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks. Those festivals, those 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, all happen in the springtime, March, April, and then the 50 days, and then the Feast of Weeks. I don't know if you can picture this, but if you're thinking about the calendar like a big circle, so the first month is in the spring, and as you worked your way down, Pentecost would be about here, and then there would be this long wait until you got to the very bottom in the 7th month. And that would be the fall. The time frame would be September or October. And actually what I'll do, I'll move to this side of the stage as I talk about these next 3. There were 3 more festivals. They all happened in the 7th month. So we've gone down to here. And these are those festivals. The first one was called the Feast of Trumpets. And what would happen now, this is right near the major harvest at the end of end of summer, the beginning of fall. This was right in the middle of the time of the major harvest. It was when you were the busiest. You would stop. You would do no work at all. Instead, you just blow trumpets the whole day. I mean, it was just, and I mean, it does sound a little funny now that I'm doing it, but I mean, it really had this kind of great significance. In fact, today, this day is called Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, which is funny because we've come all the way down here to the bottom. We're in the 7th month. So why is it the New Year? Actually, what's happening, and this is kind of a tidbit of history, I guess, that just helps us understand things, is that actually in the Old Testament, people we do this today, followed 2 different calendars. Like we're finishing the old year, we're about to start a new year. And that's one calendar, kind of the annual calendar. But then we also have like calendars like the school schedule, right? We have a school calendar that starts in August, kind of goes through summer break. So we follow 2 calendars. They did as well. So they had this religious calendar, which started with the month in which you'd celebrate Passover, and you get all the way down here to the fall. And then you had kind of the world or annual calendar, which would start in the fall with the New Year, with the Feast of Trumpets. And the idea was this. You're right in the busiest time of your harvest. And you know how it is, like when you're going, maybe that's the time where you kind of forget about God. And then all of a sudden there'd be like this wake-up call. Boop, 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 boop. Stop working. Remember, it's all God. Like this harvest you're taking in, it's all from God. So on the first day of the 7th month, right in the busiest time of the year, you just blow trumpets all day long, reminding you that it's all from God. God is present. All right, on the 10th day of that month, there was really what was the most holy of days, the Day of Atonement. And on that day, you would sacrifice these sacrifices, remembering that God's taken away your guilt. He's taken away your shame. You've been brought back together with Him. It was just such a great celebration. But then just a few days later, there would be another major feast. All God's people would travel to Jerusalem, and they'd celebrate together. It was called the Feast of Tabernacles. And the Feast of Tabernacles, now this was at the end, after all the harvest had come in. God's people would gather together, and they'd actually take from the very best of what God had given them. They'd have all these branches, palm branches and poplar branches, and they'd bring them, and they'd actually wave them before God, and for a whole week, celebrate everything that God had done for them. And I mean, there was such joy and celebration and rejoicing. And actually what God had them do, not only were they remembering that God had taken care of them with the harvest and all their food had come from God and He's done everything for them, but at the same time, they were remembering back to the fact that God had saved them from Egypt. And when God saved His people from Egypt, they didn't have houses to live in. They lived in tents or tabernacles or booths. And so what would happen is when they came to Jerusalem, every family would build a booth or a tent or a tabernacle, and they'd kind of live outdoors. You got to think of like 100,000 people in a city living in these temporary booths. They would make meals, they would eat together, they would sing together, they would dance, they would just a whole week praising the greatness of God, who not only provided for them every way, but also had saved them because they were once slaves in Egypt. So those are the 7 feasts or festivals. And now that you have kind of that basic information, I want to now talk about the character of these feasts. Because there's a lot of similarities from one feast to the next, and they had a certain character. And let's go back to verse 3, where we talked about the Sabbath day. Because if you read this entire chapter, you're going to find a phrase repeated again and again and again and again. So verse 3 says, there's 6 days when you may work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work wherever you live. It's a Sabbath to the Lord. One of the key, characteristics of all these festivals is this phrase, don't do any work. And if you begin to read through, you'll see that in each one of these festivals, you've got to stop working. Just don't work. Rest. In fact, will you look with me at the Day of Atonement, beginning in verse 26? Let's just read through that so that you can kind of see the character of these festivals, beginning in verse 26. The Lord said to Moses, the 10th day of the 7th month is a day of atonement. Hold a sacred assembly and, this phrase is interesting, deny yourselves and present an offering made to the Lord by fire. do no work on that day, because it's a day of atonement, when atonement is made for you before the Lord your God. Anyone who does not deny himself on that day must be cut off from his people. And if you didn't get it so far, then there's another phrase here. I will destroy from among his people anyone who does any work on that day. And in case you still didn't get it, you shall do no work at all. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, wherever you live. And if you still didn't get it, it's a Sabbath of rest for you. And you must, here's this phrase again, deny yourselves. From the evening of the 9th day of the month until the following evening, you are to observe your Sabbath. An interesting phrase. Don't work. Deny yourselves. Right? It's toward the end of the harvest. I mean, there's probably all this pressure to get things done. I mean, you know what that's right? And the busyness of everything. I mean, yeah, I know we should take time for God, but I've just got all these things to do. No. Deny yourself. Stop. Don't work. In fact, anyone who can't deny themselves, who just gives into their impulses and goes on working like nothing's going on, like, you can't be part of my people. In fact, I mean, I don't know about you, but it's like God gets all Al Capone on his people. Like, if you don't stop, I mean, you're going to die. It's like, no, if you're one of God's people, I mean, you stop working. You stop working. And there's a reason why, and it all has to do with the fact that God wants his people to celebrate, which is another part of the characteristic of these days. There's this phrase again and again and again, you've got to celebrate. In fact, if you will, I want to just look at this Feast of Tabernacles just toward the end, so you can kind of get a sense of the type of celebration that God was looking for when people gathered together for these feasts. Look with me beginning in verse 40. On the first day, you're to take choice fruit from the trees, and palm fronds, leafy branches, and poplars, and rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. Celebrate this as a festival to the Lord for 7 days each year. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. Celebrate it in the 7th month. Live in booths for 7 days. All native-born Israelites are to live in booths, so your descendants will know that I had the Israelites live in booths when I brought them out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Did you see that key word again and again? Celebrate. I mean, if you're going to be my people, then you have to be the kind of people who can celebrate, who can rejoice, whose hearts are filled with joy, and you can stop, and you've got to quit working and sing and celebrate. And I wish I knew how to explain what this was like. I mean, when we gather together for worship, that's what we're doing, right? We're celebrating the goodness of God, but I don't mean it like how we do it. I mean, the way we do it, I mean, okay, it wasn't just for 1 hour on Sunday morning. It was for a whole week, 7 days. And you just got to picture this, that people came from all over the place. I mean, they were up in Galilee, they were down in the Judean wilderness, and they'd go up to Jerusalem. And as they went on their way, there were actually these songs that they sang. I mean, you can find the songs that they sang. They're actually Psalms 120 through 134, if you want to read through them later. I lift my eyes to the hill. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the name of the Lord who made the heavens and the earth. And there was this way in which, okay, you're with your cousins, you're with your family, you're with your friends, your whole village, you're all going up together. It might be a 2-day hike just to get up there. And then when you get there, you're going to build these booths. You're going to live outdoors. There's going to be all kinds of meals that you make. People are going to come and you're going to share your food with one another. And it's not like the way when we get together and have a dinner where it's like, okay, let's get this thing over with so we can be out of here in an hour and a half. I mean, I hope the potato salad's good. Or, I mean, people would really eat. And they'd take time with one another. And for 7 days, there'd be songs of rejoicing and joy. And people they'd enjoy God and fellowship with one another. And I just don't know how to describe it. It wasn't like this. It was more like the Super Bowl. Or like the Daytona 500 where everyone's like tailgating. Or okay, for me, many of you know I'm a Chicago Cubs fan, right? And all you Yankee fans, you can just tune out because I don't care. But it's been more than 100 years. And one of these times, we're going to the World Series. And when we get there, and we win in the 9th inning with a home run, and the crowd goes wild, and I'm like, yeah, at the top of my lungs, take that, Yankees! I mean, when it's like that. And I'm just, slapping high five, and the city of Chicago is just in mayhem. That's what I mean when I talk about celebrate. Not like we do when we come in here and kind of sing half-hearted under our breath, I mean out there. Because that's what it was like. I mean, people were there, and from the bottom of their heart, they were grateful because God has provided everything for them, and He saved them. And it's like, you think the Chicago Cubs were underdogs. These people were slaves, and they had nothing, and God brought them out from there, and they're like, yes. And by the way, I mean, there was part of the character of this thing where it wasn't just for me, but there's a way in which one generation would kind of model for the next generation who God was. In fact, I have these verses from Psalm 145. Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. His greatness no one can fathom. One generation commends your works to another. They tell of your mighty acts. They tell of the power of your awesome works, and I will proclaim your great deeds. They celebrate your abundant goodness and joyfully sing your righteousness. You hear that? Like, one generation is going to commend God's works to another. And so when you're going with your kids and you're hiking up to Jerusalem and you're singing these songs of joy as you hike there, and as you get there and you live in booths, and for 7 days you're just eating and celebrating, and you're waving the choice fruit from your vineyards and the choice grain from your fields, and you're just, God is so good. Like, your kids start picking something up about who this God is. And so God had just ordered the calendar so that in regular ways, people they'd stop working and they'd celebrate. And just to say this, I don't know what, from your various different backgrounds or traditions, the picture of God you grew up with. But at least for me, there was this way in which you kind of looked at God as like the biggest killjoy in the universe. Like, his job was to stamp out fires of fun wherever they existed. I mean, that's the impression that I got. But I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, God's like the biggest party animal there is. Like, if you don't party, you can't be one of my people. I mean, you're going to stop working, and you're going to celebrate, and you're going to deny yourself, and you're just going to rejoice. And I think, to some extent, however you've pictured God in the past, like, this chapter has to begin to inform your picture of who God is. I mean, He is a God who wants His people not to be quiet, but to rejoice. Does that make sense? All right, now, I've talked about how these festivals look to the past, in the sense that people were thankful for this good creation and the harvest and that type of thing, and also look not only to creation, but salvation, because these people were slaves in Egypt, and God brought them out of there and settled them in homes, and so they were rejoicing for that reason. But all these festivals, they are actually about something more than that. And I wish I just had more time than I have this morning to talk about them, because, I mean, it's so amazing to me. But I guess I picture it like this. Like, for hundreds of years, God had His people celebrating in this way on this calendar. I mean, at the start of the year, they had these 3 major feasts, and then they came around to Pentecost and the Feast of Weeks, and then they came down here to the New Year and to the Feast of Trumpets and to the Feast of Tabernacles, and they just celebrated together, and then it started all for hundreds of years. And I guess I picture it in my mind as like breadcrumbs. Every time they celebrated, it's like they just took one more step because they were anticipating something that was coming in the future. And like I said, I wish I had more time with it, and I just don't. But let me just give you a hint of it by talking about the first 4 festivals. And let's just start with Passover, which you'll remember on that day there was a lamb that was sacrificed, and that lamb's blood kind of covered over the doorpost. And if you had the blood over your doorpost and were covered by that blood, then you were safe. It was all about salvation. And we've already talked about, because when we studied the book of Exodus, we talked about the Passover. We talked about how the fact that, you remember what day was it upon which Jesus was crucified? You remember, right? It was the Passover. The Passover came, and He was crucified on the day of the Passover. And we talked about how John the Baptist, when he saw Jesus for the first time, you remember what he said? Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. How Jesus is the Passover lamb, and it's His death that actually frees us from sin and covers over our guilt and our shame. Okay, and a lot of Christians, they know that already, that Jesus was crucified on the Passover. But now you know that there were two other festivals that coincided with the Passover. The next one started on the next day. It was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it went for a whole week. And maybe here's how I can get at it. This is the idea. In the Old Testament, yeast or leaven had to do with sin and wickedness. And the idea was that God actually, because he was who he was the God who takes away our sin, who takes away our wickedness. And so right after Passover, it was just part of the celebration that for the next 7 days, you ate bread that had no yeast in it. And it's so fascinating to me, it was actually worked into the Passover celebration. And this is what would happen on the night in which you'd celebrate Passover. Actually, the meal would begin this way. There were actually 3 pieces of unleavened bread that were brought out. And if you're a Christian, I mean, you just have to wonder about how this all came about. So there were these 3 pieces of unleavened bread, and it was part of every Passover celebration. The oldest person